Gil Friend, CEO of Natural Logic Incorporated and founder of Critical Path Capital, advises leading companies, communities, and investors on business driving sustainability strategies. Gil is the author of The Truth About Green Business and more than 100 articles on strategy, policy, and performance. Gil has been a noted sustainability pioneer for nearly 50 years and is widely considered one of the founders of the sustainable business movement. In the 1970s, after working 2 summers with Buckminster Fuller's World Game Workshop, he was convinced that a world that works for all was not just desirable, but possible, framing the commitments that was to become his life's work. To bring those insights to local communities, he co-founded the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, where he advocated for the integration of urban food, waste, and energy systems, and designed and built the first rooftop farm in the United States. In the 1980s, as part of Governor Jerry Brown's staff, he wrote the executive order for California's Agricultural Investment Fund, advancing sustainable agriculture research. As founder of the Foundation for Arts and Peace, he developed peace propaganda campaigns on mainstream media and co-founded one of the first internet companies. In the mid-1990s, Gil designed and developed the first corporate sustainability dashboard. In the 2000s, he built Natural Logic into a leading sustainable business consultancy and wrote The Truth About Green Business, which John Elkington named one of the best sustainable business guides he'd read this century. In the 2010s, as the Chief Sustainability Officer for the city of Palo Alto, Gil led the city to unanimously adopt the most aggressive sustainability policy in the U.S. and the toughest green building standards in California. He also advocated for new approaches to mobility and land use planning. Now, in the 2020s, he's bringing all of that experience to bear in the development of Critical Path Capital and the Critical Path Academy that are focused on providing business strategies grounded in sustainability. He was named an inaugural member of the Sustainability Hall of Fame, one of the top 10 voices in sustainability in the U.S., and twice as one of the top 25 influencers in clean tech. Please welcome Gil Friend.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for asking me to join you today. When Sonia and I first spoke in early March, it was a different world, one that included large numbers of humans gathering together for strange rituals like conferences. Just as none of us anticipated a rapid global economic lockdown, I suspect none of us anticipated where we would be now 6 months in. So with your permission, I'll both touch on some of the themes that she and I flagged originally and on what has emerged, where we are, and where we go now in this era of head-spinning change, both for good and for ill. The for ill is obvious: death, fear, economic contraction, the shredding of trust, and the social contract. The for good, yes, even in the midst of the pandemic, includes the enormous progress of the sustainability and sustainable design revolutions. Over the past few decades, we've seen the price of renewable energy and energy storage plummet, shifting the matters that we all care about from the fringes to the heart of the market. We've seen bold decarbonization goals from companies and cities, deepening policy rigor from jurisdictions of all sizes and flavors, with, of course, one notable exception. We've seen the rise of the circular economy and the pending demise of the fossil economy. Here in the land of BuiltGreen, you have all delivered stellar results for the built environment of the Puget Sound region. But it's all too slow. It's all too slow. Very few countries, companies, or cities are meeting their Paris climate commitments, and the commitments themselves are far too meager and far too tame. We're held back by cautious policy environments, by deeply flawed economic methodologies, by powerful vested interests, and other contributors to what Alex Steffen so tenderly calls predatory delay. So I'm here to challenge you today, as committed, capable professionals who have accomplished so much, to push beyond the familiar, the comfortable, the obvious, and to do the unprecedented, to orient to futures we can't predict. Futures filled with what Peter Schwartz calls inevitable surprises. Let me address 4 main themes today. What connects the multiple crises we're facing and the inevitable surprises that lie ahead? What are the new worlds that these crises reveal to us, and how might we prepare ourselves to step into them? What does this all mean for your particular area of concern, green buildings and the communities in which you build them? And what is to be done? We face multiple crises. We watch the signs. We attempt to read the tea leaves. We're fed confusing signals. Stock market up, human well-being down. What's the big picture? We're understandably freaked out about COVID-19. We're adapting as best we can, longing for an end to it and for a vaccine, but with little understanding of the world we have entered. We're understandably focused on defensive public health measures, but we're blind to the fact that we've entered what Dr. Fernando Flores calls the pandemic era. Why era? Well, first of all, the problem is not the virus or viruses. Our bodies contain thousands of species of viruses. As with bugs in agriculture, bacteria in our gut, these viruses are mostly benign, sometimes beneficial, and occasionally harmful. As with agriculture, as with gut health, so with viruses, the issue is not just the vector, but the health of the system. Second, we continue to disrupt the boundary between human and wild. Through both the wet markets of China, where people are buying, selling, slaughtering, and eating animals from outside the familiar biome of humans and our domesticated companions, and the penetration of cities into wildlands and native landscapes with a concurrent disruption of habitat that puts critters on the move, we continue to expose human populations to more and more organisms that we have not been historically exposed to, biological insults that we may not have antibodies or responses for. Third, we're beginning to recognize the health impacts of climate too, finally, and recognize that both personal health and public health both actually matter. As with agriculture, the issue is rarely just the organism which is disrupting the system. It's also the capacity of the system to respond to the organism. So the healthier I am, the better I'm likely to do with a virus. The pandemic, though, has reminded us that there is no such thing as personal health. There's only public health. No matter how well I take care of myself, my family and I can't be healthy if the world around us is a mess. For example, it's well established that rising temperatures accelerate biological activity. So as we enter a warming world, diseases may accelerate. The elderly and otherwise vulnerable become more vulnerable. People will not be able to work outdoors in many parts of the world. What happens to agriculture and construction in such a world? So we need both. Personal health, a population with vibrant immune systems that has the resilience to handle insults, and public health, the social solidarity and shared commitment to take care of each other, providing everything from hospitals and testing services to clean air and clean water. Fourth, but with the understandably near-term focus on the present pandemic, the attention to climate change has taken a bit of a back seat. Not completely. There are bold corporate initiatives. There's still the Green New Deal on the table in the United States and Europe and New Zealand, and to varying degrees in China and other places. But it doesn't have the frontline urgency it needs. I'm not criticizing anyone for that. It's completely understandable. We know it's challenging for organizations to deal with multiple problems at the same time. But we need to develop that capacity because the world is not going to be polite and say, well, I'll hold off on this next crisis until you solve the current one. The crises will come as they come, and we have to build the muscle, the institutional muscle, and emotional fortitude to deal with that. Fifth, unfortunately, COVID and climate are not the only crises we face. I'm recording this in the San Francisco Bay Area, surrounded by fires and smoke, emblematic of a willful blindness to the well-known dynamics of ecosystems in which we build and live. Oceans, fisheries, soil, biodiversity in decline around the world. Systemic racism and top-heavy economic instability. The joint failures of modern capitalism and Earth's ancient life support systems. What's in your wallet? The list can be overwhelming, but what if there's a pattern that connects? What if there are both common factors and maybe even some common solutions to overcoming the reductionist disconnects between our economic systems and the regenerative systems of this living planet that sustain everything we value? What's coming next? Who knows? As physicist Niels Bohr wisely observed, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So I caution my friends and clients and colleagues who claim certainty about elections and markets and vaccines, and remind them no one in December 2019 was anticipating the shutdown of the global economy in the first quarter of 2020. No one in March 2020 predicted that one more televised murder of one more Black American at the hands of the police would trigger an unprecedented reaction to systemic racism in this country. It reminds us that all our friends who've been telling us for months that the November election is all locked up are about as useful as stock touts and track tipsters, and are about as honorable as people who would rather try to predict the future than try to influence it. Part of the profound unsettlement we feel in the midst of COVID is the recognition, the acknowledgement of the profound uncertainty we find ourselves living in. This is a healthy realization because, in fact, this has always been where we've lived. We've just learned to pretend that there's solid ground under our feet. But what if there never was? Never is, never will be solid ground under our feet. How then do we live in such a world? How do we build the capacity in ourselves, in our businesses, our communities to navigate a rapidly changing landscape, to anticipate the inevitable surprises, and to live with peace of mind and even grace in the midst of instability that would otherwise drive us crazy? In fact, the pandemic has shattered our sense of what's normal and what's possible. A poll in April found that only 9% of Britons want to return to normal after the coronavirus outbreak is over. People have noticed significant changes during the lockdown, the pollsters report, including cleaner air, more wildlife, and stronger communities. More than half hope that they will make some changes in their own lives and for the country as a whole to learn from the crisis. 2/5 said that there's a stronger sense of community in their area since the outbreak began, and 39% say they're catching up with friends and families more. Halfway around the world in New Delhi, people were shocked to be seeing the Himalayas for the first time in more than 30 years. And people asked themselves, which view, which atmosphere is normal? What will we settle for? This is one of the great gifts of the pandemic, hidden within the fear and suffering. We've gotten a glimpse of a different world, one we had abandoned to resignation long ago. But now, with a glimpse into the possibility of a different world, possible because we can actually see it and feel it and taste it, our appetite shifts, our willingness to settle shifts, our commitment to change shifts. Anyone who's been in the green building and design world knows this. It's one thing to talk with someone about the benefits of green building, or even about the economics, but quite another to let them walk into a well-designed green building and feel the difference in their own personal body and watch the mood shift from "this isn't practical" or "I can't have this" to "I want this." So what might be possible now? Now that we've seen in the global COVID response a scale and scope and speed and degree of human coordination that we never thought possible. Yes, it's uneven across jurisdictions. Yes, it's bedeviled by confusion, disinformation, and lack of trust. But still, it challenges us to reconsider how fast we can mobilize when we really have to. Of course, I'm thinking about the climate crisis looming behind the COVID crisis, like the minute hand of a clock, moving too slowly to notice, but moving inexorably nonetheless. So what might be possible if we approached our other crises and challenges, climate, social justice, and the greening of our cities and building stock with the scale and scope and speed and degree of coordination and urgency that we've brought to the COVID crisis? In fact, with the COVID covenant, my colleagues and I have challenged sustainability leaders and leading companies to do just that. So let's move from the big picture to the more focused concerns of BuiltGreen and those of you watching today, the greening of the built environment and the greening of our cities. As the BuiltGreen website says, the program has far exceeded its original expectations. As of June 2000, BuiltGreen has certified over 20,000 single-family and multifamily projects, creating more than 36,000 green households in the Puget Sound region. In 2019, 73% of all single-family homes built in Seattle were BuiltGreen certified. It's a stunning accomplishment. But let's zoom back out. That 36,000 households out of more than 1.1 million in the region represent just a few percent of the households in the region. Not as stunning a statistic in that context. And I raise this not as a criticism of BuiltGreen, but as a recognition of the scale of challenge that still lies ahead. Now, I recognize that most of BuiltGreen's work focuses on new construction, but new construction is just a tiny fraction of the standing building stock, as it is in any city. This is a rate of change that may look sustainable for your companies, but does not bring us to sustainability. Housing starts may not be something you can do anything about on your own. They're tied to overall economic conditions and many other factors. But a net zero city, a carbon neutral city, a city living and thriving on its ambient resources will require a rethinking and a reconfiguration of existing housing stock as well. Let's consider the technical aspects first and then retrofit strategies. California's energy policy loading order of efficiency first, then renewables, then electrification offers a useful strategic framework. Sustainable design usually begins with eliminating waste. In fact, that was the essential path when the cost of renewables was high. The driver was building codes, incentives, as well as early adopters. Now, as renewable prices continue to plummet, their penetration is growing exponentially, and net zero buildings become a reality and a requirement in many markets. The driver is market forces as well as policy. And ahead of us is the challenge of electrification. The new policy driver, as pioneered in Berkeley, natural gas bans, followed, as is often the case, by dozens of other cities, the rapidly declining cost of energy storage, and the promise of microgrids. There's resistance and concerns, consumer habits, grid dynamics, and the massive stranded assets of the utility industry. And there are other issues: grid management, energy storage, vehicle-to-grid, microgrid, and shared facilities. Embedded energy, which argues for retrofits more than new construction, a theme I'll return to shortly. Water, a different issue for you in Washington than for us in California. But everything, including precipitation patterns, is changing. How do you design for resilience and adaptability when climate cycles are changing faster than planning cycles and the life cycle of buildings? There's air quality, filtration, air exchange, material selections, and now architectural design that incorporates the pandemic situation and needs are before us. Planning and building for the regional ecosystems that you're building in, and going beyond buildings to address sprawl and the urban form and the transportation demand they engender. And last but not least, of course, what challenges will the new generation of modular prefab homes and towers and ADUs pose to you? What opportunities will they open? So let me return to the topic of retrofit at scale. This was one of many challenges we faced in the city of Palo Alto, and I'm sad to say, one of my failures there. As part of our electrification strategy, we were developing plans with the Palo Alto Municipal Utility to transition some 25,000 housing units to heat pump water heaters. Utility staff proposed a pilot program of a few dozen homes per year for a few years. I proposed working backwards from the target of 25,000 units in, say, 10 years. A pace more like 2,500 units per year, about 10 per day, and invited us to explore what would have to happen to make that possible. My colleagues, unfortunately, were reluctant to even engage the exploration. And yet in Holland, the Energy Sprong program is taking 14,000 homes to net zero in less than 10 days per home. Yes, the circumstances and the housing stock and the policy environment are all different, but the need is not, which is why New York State and California are adapting the program to their circumstances. The reality is that improvement rates of 1% per year or 2% per year don't get us to 80% in 30 years, or 20, or 10, or to zero anytime soon enough. So where do you place yourselves in this trajectory of change? I would suggest as far ahead as you possibly can. As we've often told our clients at Natural Logic, ranging from gutsy startups to the world's most respected companies, the hell with the regulations. Not violate them, but ignore them as a guidance system except at the most operational level. Instead, guide yourselves strategically by a different beacon, what the world needs and how the world works. What the world needs, as my mentor Buckminster Fuller put it, a world that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time, through spontaneous cooperation, without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. How the world works? Well, you know this because you've got the open source playbook of 3.8 billion years of evolutionary development of systems that are productive, efficient, adaptive, and resilient. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The R&D has all been done. There are constraints and challenges, of course. We need to bring markets along as well as regulators. We need to grow capacity in the building trades, but what a job engine that could be. Well, to meet these constraints, we'll have to ask ourselves a different set of questions. What might be possible? What's actually needed? What might happen if? What if? What if you decided, as Richard Powers wrote in his exceptional novel, The Overstory, what you make from a tree should be at least as miraculous as what you cut down? Let me be more specific. What if we could transform the building stock of a city in a decade or two, not a half century or two? What would it take to do that in policy, in industry capacity, in financing resources, in market readiness, etc.? You've all been moving very well on the pieces of the puzzle, except for one piece, speed. Again, I don't say that critically. We all did the best with what we had. We all did the best we could with what we knew in the circumstances of the times. But we know more now, and the circumstances have changed. What would it take to fire up the afterburners on everything we've done for the past decades? I encourage you to ask the question, and even if you may not be able to answer it, because you may well discover opportunities that you've never thought of and never would have thought of if you didn't pose the question. What if we didn't build houses, but instead built microgrid blocks and neighborhoods with energy, water, food self-reliance, and mobility needs designed in, as is being done from Oakland to China, as we first proposed at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance back in 1973. What if we designed and built and regulated and lived as though our cities and communities and homes were living beings, providing the 60-plus functions of a tree, harvesting energy, cleaning water and air, enriching soil, building resilience? What if our planning systems permitted no diminution of ecological function? As the city of Durban with the Biomimicry Institute have been exploring with the 27 ecological function layers they've identified there and have built into their planning matrices. What if we could design, permit, build, and commission buildings at the speed of China, where 75-story buildings are coming up in less than 3 weeks, one from a sustainable builder, and a 30-story building in less than 2 weeks? What enables them to do that? What can we learn? Here's a hint. It's not just regulations. What might that ability be worth to you? Looked at another way, this speaks to another kind of waste, what my colleague Chauncey Bell calls coordination waste. What is lost in the promises and requests we make or don't make to each other? So, what new questions do you now need to ask? Well, how will you coordinate to enable your team or organization to build the capacity it will need in the world that is hurtling toward us? What conversations will you need to have? What commitments will you need to make? I've outlined a big and challenging agenda here. How fast can we mobilize? Today it doesn't look good. Today we bemoan a United States that has lost its sense of solidarity and purpose and can't even reliably provide personal protective equipment in 6 months. Really? Because in 1942, weeks after the Pearl Harbor attack that catapulted the United States into World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt convened the heads of the American automobile industry at the White House. Gentlemen, he said, we need to convert this economy to war footing immediately. One of the CEOs responded, Mr. President, we knew that's why you brought us here, and I'm glad to tell you that we all have plans in motion to phase out civilian production for war production as soon as possible. FDR said, you don't understand. You're out of civilian production right now. And in 9 months, the United States had built the biggest war machine in the world, and the Nazis were defeated on the factory floors of America, not just the battlefields of Europe and Africa. So my closing challenges to you are 3. Number 1, know that even though incremental steps are essential in large, complex, bold undertakings, it wasn't incrementalism that got humanity to the moon and back. So ask yourself, are my goals sufficient to the challenges, the risks, and the opportunities that we face? Is sustainability a worthy enough goal when the challenge is to nurture the regenerative capacity of the Gaian systems on which all that we value depends? Number 2, know that every time your company makes a capital investment or commits to a supplier, every time it launches a product or makes an offer in the marketplace, every time you personally buy a car or a meal or a t-shirt, every time you slap a dollar or a dinar or a pound or a mark or a ruble on the counter, you're voting for a future, for a world. Not every 4 years, every day. So ask, what future is this spend voting for? Number 3, know that the purpose of your business is not, as Milton Friedman famously said, to maximize returns to capital. It is, as Bank of America founder A.P. Giannini said, to do what the business is there to do. So ask yourself, what business are you really in? And now that the concerns that we in this community have nurtured and provoked for so long are finally moving to the center of the dialogue, I invite you to consider Bucky Fuller's declaration. If humanity does not opt for integrity, we are through completely. The odds are so close, it's completely touch and go. Each one of us could make the difference. That is why I do what I do. So since the best way to predict the future is to create it, why do you do what you do?